All right, my time says 11 Central, so we will go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the final webinar in our Midday Master Beef webinar series. I'm a little biased, but I think it's been a great series to be able to join in the middle of your day. Lots of great speakers, lots of topics, and we really hope that you've taken something and found something that you can take back to your herd and your operation to improve it. All right. And just a reminder, if you want to ask any speaker or content related questions, just send them in the Q&A and I will ask Dr. Rowan at the end. And as a refresher, because I know we haven't had any polling questions in the past couple webinars, but we will today. So you will see those pop up. I'll activate on the pop up. You'll have about 60 seconds to answer each polling question. And again, if they don't pop up for some reason based on the browser you're watching in, it's no big deal at all. These are really just for some interaction during the webinar. And yeah, so for our grand finale speaker, we have our very own Dr. Troy Rowan. He's an assistant professor in our UTIA Genomics Center. For those of you who haven't met Dr. Rowan, I think he started about a year ago, maybe last January, Dr. Rowan. But he's hit the ground running, doing a lot of great research that I'm not even going to begin to try to explain. But I think you're going to really like his talk today about making some profit-driven breeding decisions and using selection indexes to do so. So I will stop sharing and turn it over to you.
All right, and I will hopefully share the right screen here. All right, this all looks good.
Yep, you're good to go.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks again, Courtney, for getting me scheduled here for the Midday Master Beefs. These are good. I'm usually got a little bit more brain power left over at noon than I do at 7 o'clock Eastern time that the normal webinars are at. And I just had a handful of trail mix for my lunch. So we're gonna, you got a fully fueled and mentally here, Troy today. So like Courtney said, we're going to talk a little bit about selection indexes and in the power that I think that we have as commercial cattle producers to really simplify the selection decision and take into account lots of different traits and make profit-driven breeding decisions. Because I think that's really at the core of what we're trying to do as commercial cattlemen. And so before I dive into EPDs or selection decisions or breeding plans or whatever, I think it's really helpful to contextualize just how important this bull selection process is for the commercial cow-calf producer, right? And I think that it's one of the biggest decisions that we make as commercial producers. Choosing this bull can have really big influences in the immediate term, right? So if we conservatively guess that this bull is going to sire at least 100 calves in our herd, it will keep, possibly 20 replacement females out of this set of 100 calves. It's easy to see that the immediate term, yeah, there's a lot of animals here that this bull's going to sire, but also the multi-generational aspect of this whole thing, right? These replacement females are going to stay in the herd for years and they're going to have calves. And so really nailing this bull selection decision can make you a lot of money right away. And it can also make you a lot of money in the future if these replacement females are the profitable kind that we're trying to identify and breed, right? And so the question that always pops up, whether we're sitting at a bull sale or thumbing through a semen catalog trying to pick out an AI sire, is this bull worth that extra however much, right? I say $1,500 in this example because I think that a lot of times that's what we're up against, right? Can we afford that, high middle tier bull versus one of those bulls that's maybe in the low tier at the sale that we're at? And is he worth that extra $1,500? And my answer is always that if that bull has the genetic potential to add 20 pounds of weaning weight per calf, he very quickly over the course of his life makes up for this difference in price, right? Just in direct calf weaning weight, not factoring anything else in, if he has that genetic potential to increase something like weaning weight to that degree, right? And in this number I calculated months ago, right? But the way that the markets are right now, you could certainly make up that a lot faster on less calves, right? But the real money maker comes in these replacement females, right? And if this bull, we're paying $1,500 extra for him, he's making all of that money back and more on the added weaning weight per calf. But also he's got fertile daughters. 90% of them are making it to that profitable age of 6 years old. That's sort of the threshold that we've drawn in a cow staying in the herd to that point, she's recouped the costs of her development, she's recouped all of her maintenance costs, and she's in the green, right? She's making you money from that point forward. If that bull can make cows efficiently, he's going to make up that difference very quickly. And we can imagine a virtually infinite number of scenarios where this bull, who's $1,500 cheaper, can lose that $1,500 fairly quickly, right? So if we're having to pull 20% of our calves, we're losing calves to calving difficulties, to stotia. That bull can lose that saved money very quickly. And especially if we go to the effort to develop his daughters, but we're having to cull them from the herd for something like feet and leg issues at age 3, or they're not breeding as heifers, right? We can think again of lots of ways that this bull cannot justify this price difference, right, over the course of his life. So all of this to not necessarily say specific reasons why not we shouldn't pay more than this for this bull than another, right? But just the understanding that this decision has a big impact on the long-term success of a commercial herd, right? If we nail this bull decision, we get to reap the benefits in the immediate term and the long term. If we fumble it, we can lose a lot right away, and it can stick around in the herd for multiple generations if we're keeping replacement females. And the other important thing that I'll point out in the context of commercial cow-calf production is that most of the genetic progress that we have in our herds, right? If we're breeding cattle, we want this generation to be better than last generation. We want the next generation to be better than this generation, right? So we're always striving to make cattle better, and genetics is a big piece of that, right? But understanding that the majority of our genetic progress on the commercial side is going to come from the bulls that we import into our herds, right? The bull that we're going out and buying, the sire that we identify in our AI catalog, whatever that looks like, that's going to contribute to the long-term genetic progress in your herd. And that's a really important thing. Another reason, not just those really direct examples of price differences in gaining or losing money, but understanding that the long-term success, even in the traits that we're making incremental progress on, most of that progress is going to be made in really nailing this breeding decision. So I think that it's helpful to think about before we dive into how should we choose those bulls to maximize profitability, that we all really ground ourselves, no matter what our operation looks like. We might have 10 head, we might have 500 head, but really understanding what we're working towards is the biggest thing that I think we can do before we get into the nitty gritty and the dozens of different selection tools that breed associations have reported. We need to understand what makes us money, right? And I think that having a breeding goal, understanding how you make money, how your cows can make you more profitable, all of those things are really important for us to keep in mind, again, before we dive into the sire selection process itself. So I like to talk a little bit about breeding goals before we jump into selection index talk, because I think that it's important for us to understand what makes us profitable, right? And keeping in mind that profit is a sort of double-edged sword, right? What brings revenue in, so understanding what generates money, and also understanding what our costs are. So what's costing us, what's chipping away at that revenue that we could maybe mitigate that a little bit and maximize profit in our herds. And I say sustainable as I think that our breeding goals need to be long-term in their outlook, in some degree, and long-term might differ based on the operation, depending on where you're at in the development of your herd and your career as a producer, right? But I think that these things need to have a view out into the future, and I think that they need to be very profit driven, right? And that's going to be the big piece that we talk about today. How do we make selection decisions that are a part of this breeding goal that make us more profitable and ultimately more sustainable, right? So that we've got an operation that we can pass on to our to future generations, or just keeping you in the business for the long term. Whatever sustainable looks like, having these breeding goals is an important piece of that. I think our breeding goals need to be data driven for a couple of reasons. One of those reasons is using data to make our selection decisions. So that's an important piece, and you'll hear me talk a lot about EPDs. Today we're talking about selection indexes. Those are ways for us to make data driven decisions. But I think on the flip side, we need to be data driven in how we operate our our operation, right? And that can come down really to record keeping, I think, right? Understanding our costs, our revenue sources, how those have changed over time. Tracking genetic progress in the form of record keeping is also really important. So if we're not keeping track of how our cattle are performing, we don't have a good gauge of how our selection decisions have either improved or maybe drug us back a little bit as we look over the long term. So being data driven is not just in using these selection tools to make breeding decisions, but also keeping tabs on the status of our herd and understanding how that genetic progress is manifesting itself. I won't speak a lot about breeding goals being realistic, but I think that it's a really important thing for us to keep in mind that our environment, our management level, that's going to differ from operation to operation. And that's going to need to be reflected in the type of animals that we're selecting, right? And so if we're an operation that, we've got a couple of jobs in our family in town and the cows are an extra revenue stream, right? But we don't have the same sort of time that we can put into supplementing these animals maybe, or being really intensive about how we manage them, whether that's rotational grazing, whatever that looks like. We need to be realistic about what we can input into our operation based on our abilities as managers and also as our production environment, right? So understanding that we've got a really unique resource in this part of the world in fescue, but also understanding that bringing an animal in from outside of the fescue belt, there might be some challenges there that we might not otherwise run into. So lots of pieces there, but being conscientious of what's realistic for you is going to help you set that breeding goal as you sort of look forward at what your operation can do. And then the last thing is that these things need to be consistent. So I've seen a lot of operations from very big seed stock operations all the way to 10 head commercial operations oscillate back and forth between breeding goals from year to year. And that really defeats the point of setting a breeding goal and working towards that through sustained genetic progress, right? If we're changing the criteria that we're using to select animals on a year-to-year basis, we're not going to see that sort of sustained upward trajectory, right? We're going to be oscillating back and forth and really not making any progress on a particular trait. So I think we need to pick something that's good, it's profit driven, it's sustainable. We're making decisions that are data driven and it's realistic to our production environment. But also it needs to be flexible enough that when an issue pops up, that we can use genetics to correct, right? So something like feet and leg issues might pop up in our herd, right? We need to be flexible enough to change our breeding goal to address that problem without losing sight on that big picture, right? So that consistent but flexible is a really important part of setting a breeding goal. And I also think that our breeding goals need to go hand in hand with an operations business goal, right? So if we have a business plan, we understand where our revenue comes in from, what's costing us money, right? Then we can start to craft a breeding plan, understand the traits that make us money, the traits that lose us money if they're unfavorable. And that can allow us to really align these two things closely and make us more sustainable in the long term. And so the big questions that we need to ask before we start making a sire selection decision is number one, how do we market our cattle, right? And most everybody in the state of Tennessee, right, is going to market our calves at weaning, but are we finding ways to market our calves with some added value, right? Are we able to put loads together? Are we able to do some sort of a genetics verified program, right? There's lots of options even to market weaned calves, right? So understanding what the best way for your particular operation to do that is something you need to keep in mind. And that's going to dictate the sort of bull that you go out and buy. There's also, I think, a renewed interest in this freezer beef world. So the traits that someone who's marketing all their calves at weaning versus someone who's marketing freezer beef, the traits that you care about are going to differ there, right? If we're trying to maximize weaning weight as a revenue source in traditional cow-calf, whereas we might care about some more of those in product traits if we're raising freezer beef, right? So we're gonna see sort of diverging paths on our selection decisions depending on how we market whatever our end product is. The other really, really big thing we need to keep in mind is, are we purchasing or are we keeping replacement females? Because that opens up a whole nother suite of traits that we need to care about when we're selecting a bull if we're keeping his daughters around in the herd. And I'll talk about that here in a slide or two. But knowing whether or not we're keeping replacement females, whether that's a part of the breeding goal, gonna play a big part in which traits we care about when we're selecting animals. And then again, being conscientious of our resources, our management level, understanding that, we might be able to get really big weaned calf weights, but if our forage base isn't there to support the sort of performance that we're wanting to see to maximize this endpoint in the calf that we're marketing, we're not going to allow those animals to reach their genetic potential, right? So really being realistic about the resources and management level that we can give our cattle is going to play into that selection decision on how high a performance do we want out of this bull that we're picking. And then I throw record keeping up there again, because I think it's very, very important across the board. You guys have had lots of different talks throughout this Midday Master Beef series, but I think that record keeping is an integral piece of all of them. It allows us to evaluate the status of our operation and identify those sort of pressure points where maybe we can make improvements for our herd to be more sustainable in the long term. And I would be remiss to not post a little bit about crossbreeding here. I think that any breeding plan needs to integrate some sort of crossbreeding so that we're able to take advantage not only of the breed complementarity that allows us to allow the strengths of one breed to complement that of another on our way to a breeding goal, but also to take advantage of heterosis, that outperformance of this crossbred offspring compared to the two parental lines, right? I think that a crossbreeding plan needs to be in place for any commercial operation to really maximize the amount of value that we're able to squeeze out of our herds, right? So just a little bit of lip service to crossbreeding. I won't go a ton into this, but the important thing to keep in mind is that before we start the bull selection process, we need to have a good understanding, not only the breeding goal, but also of a crossbreeding plan, understanding which breed we need to go out and identify a bull for that particular year in our operation. And that's going to change as we bring breeds in and we get sort of a progeny base there. What breed makes the most sense to come back in the rotation to maximize that complementarity and heterosis? So something to keep in mind that allows us to focus the sire selection decision process down a little bit more. So I'm not looking at all of the surrounding breeders for Simmental, Hereford, and Angus, but really just focus in on the breed that makes the most sense for that particular year in our crossbreeding rotation. And then the last thing that I'll mention here before we jump into talking about indexes is that whatever our selection decisions are, they really need to drive genetic progress that aligns with our breeding goal, right? And that, might sound obvious, but if we come up with a breeding goal, right, we understand what makes us money and the traits that are going to make us money, we need to use that information to make our selection decisions. It's one thing to have a breeding goal, but then to go out and sort of shoot from the hip when we get to a bull sale, right? This all needs to inform the decisions that we're making at the end of the day. And so my first poll question, and Courtney can throw this up here, is what is the most important trait to select for, regardless of your production system, right? Whether you're raising freezer beef, whether you're raising replacement females, whether you're marketing all of your calves at weaning, whether you're selling your calves on a merit-based grid, what of these that I threw up here is the absolute most important trait for you to select for? And I'll let Courtney tell a joke if she's got any.
Dang, you really threw me for a loop. So I'll think of one for the next question. For those of you that haven't joined us in the past, I always used to have a joke prepared to tell while we're waiting on these questions to be answered. So I'll see what I can come up with.
We lost our joke telling professional, assistant Dean Reinhardt. So unfortunate loss there, but Courtney will come up with something, I'm sure.
We have most of the answers. I'll maybe give like 10 more seconds. There's a few more coming in.
Okay.
All right. I'm going to share these results with you.
All right. So it looks like just over 50% of people have maybe heard me talk, right? Because the answer to this question is always profitability, right? Regardless of your production system, each of these is going to be a component in one production system or another, or in the case of calving ease, this is important for everybody that's raising, that's in a cow-calf production system. No matter how you market your calves, you've got to have a live calf, right? But profitability ultimately, and all the component traits that make an animal profitable, that's the sort of trait that we want to select for, right? And it's a little bit tricky to directly select for profit, but hopefully I'll lay out in the subsequent slides here, how we can directly select for profitability using selection indexes. And so, like I said, the most important trait is profit. And in profit, like I said, is a double-edged sword. So we've got these revenue generating traits. So in the case of a traditional cow-calf operation in the state of Tennessee, we need a live calf. A dead calf is worth exactly $0. I don't even need to talk to my econ friends to figure that out, right? A live calf is worth $0. We need to maximize weaning weight pounds for that revenue, right? And traditionally, most of the selection that we've done is on these revenue focused traits, right? Maximize that check that we get at the end of the season. But then there's all these other hidden cost traits, right? These things that chip away at that revenue where we can have a really big check at the end of the year. But if our cow herd is costing us money, then it's chipping away at that overall profitability. And so, again, I think that it takes a concerted effort for us to understand all the traits that make up a profitable cow herd, not just a cow herd that generates a lot of revenue, right? So keeping in mind, not just this check at the end of the year, but also the bills that are going to be associated with raising those mature cows that are going to produce the calves that generate revenue for us. And one thing that I've focused a lot of my extension programming effort on is moving past this idea that cow focused traits are just convenience traits, right? I think that sometime in Joe Elliott can give a little bit of background on when the term convenience traits got coined, right? But Joe and I have talked a lot about this at the end of the day, these traits that we thought about just being, convenient, things like calving ease, right? It's convenient for all your cows to calve easily. But there's a very, very clear economic component to all those things, right? And so understanding that these things have an economic value and factoring that into our breeding decisions when it comes to selecting more profitable animals is really, really important. And so when we think about the costs of a cow herd, right, of a cow's sort of cost footprint in your herd, the thing that maybe comes to mind immediately is maintenance requirements, right? This is a very clear cost of the cow. She requires some sort of forage base, right, and some sort of supplementation, right? And if we can have a cow that can wean off exactly the same amount of weaned calf weight, but eat 10% less, right? Have a 10% lower maintenance requirements, that cow is more profitable for us, right? So that's a very clear way for us to see how that cow might be more profitable. But then we have to factor in what I think is probably the most important cow focused trait, and that's longevity. And I mentioned this a couple of slides ago, but the idea that a cow doesn't become profitable until she's had 5 calves, right? So this definition differs depending on where you look, right? But either a cow reaching 6 years of age without missing a calf, or some people will say she has to have 5 calves before she's profitable. The reasoning here is that if there's a real cost to doing replacement heifer development, especially if we're trying to do it right. And so making sure that we're able to maximize a cow's longevity in our herd, after she reaches this point where she's had 5 calves, she's in the green and making us money. But if we're having to cull her early, then we're losing out on that profitable part of her life, right? And so having a cow that sticks around is really important. And we know that there are lots of different ways that a cow can be culled out of the herd early. The big one is fertility. So if a cow's not getting bred, she doesn't have any business sticking around in the herd, right? So having bulls that are going to raise daughters that are more fertile, very important. Other reasons that cows get culled, right? Structural soundness. If a cow can't get around, there's going to be a level of reduced performance on her calf if she's not able to maximize her grazing and nutrient acquisition, but also just a welfare concern, right? At a certain point, if a cow can't get around, she's going to have to get culled out of the herd, and we hope that it's not early, right? That's one of the reasons why a cow might leave the herd early, though. Disposition. This is a hard one to put an economic value on a year-to-year basis, but I always tell folks that it's very easy to see how a cow can lose a lot of years of profitability in an instant if she's ill-tempered, right? So understanding that disposition is convenient, right, to have cows that have a reasonable amount of tameness, right? But it's also economically important because a wild or a mean cow can certainly lose you a lot of money very quickly, and even things that we can't put an economic value on. So disposition, another reason that when we think about these more foundational traits to a cow herd. It's very important. Udder structure, another one. This is a convenience thing. You don't want to spend a ton of time around calving season getting a calf started on a front quarter that's that big, but there's also an economic value to this, right? Your time is worth something that you're spending on getting that calf started, and also the decrease in the production the lost production, I guess, from a bad quarter where a calf maybe isn't nursing to its full potential. You're going to see that at the end of the year in lost revenue. So again, lots of these things that we've traditionally thought of as convenience traits, they're very important to how profitable your cow herd is. And so when we think about all this stuff, right? So I've talked about the revenue generating traits. I've talked about a handful of these cow focused traits that are central to profitability in a commercial herd. And then we look at all of this information, right? And this is an example from the American Angus Association, where we're reporting somewhere in the neighborhood of 24 to 28 traits. I don't remember off the top of my head, but this is a really overwhelming thing to dive right into. And we think about looking at all these traits, right? We know that calving ease is important. We want to see a live calf, and an unassisted birth is very important, especially when we're calving out heifers. So we might look at that at some degree. We need to look at weaning weight maybe, because that's the revenue source for most of our cow herds here. Milk is another thing that's important for us to keep in mind in all this, right? That's the maternal ability to wean off a heavy calf, right? So in this bull selection process, we might be looking for bulls that have daughters that have the genetic potential to wean off large calves, but also understanding that this is going to increase the maintenance requirements of that cow. So we might want something moderate in milk. We want to increase the fertility of a bull's daughters, right? So we might look at his heifer pregnancy EPD. We might want a moderate sized cow. Again, this is our best guess at some of these maintenance requirements things. So a moderate mature weight, a moderate mature height. We might take into account dry matter intake. So this is our ability to measure how much a cow is going to need as far as resources go. So we're taking all these things into account on the cow side. Then I've also told you that things like docility, very important to the sustainability of a cow herd, as well as maybe these new feet and leg phenotypes that the Angus Association is reporting. So all of a sudden, we're looking at all of these things. Some of these things are more important than others. Some of these things are genetically correlated with others. And it gets to be a really overwhelming task to look at all these things and try and balance them at once, right? And so the solution to this historically has been to either look, at one trait at a time or come up with thresholds. But more recently, we've come up with these selection tools in the form of selection indexes that allow us to look at these traits in aggregate and really select on one value that's very focused on profitability. And so this is not a new problem. This is pulled right from the paper that introduces selection indexes back in the 1940s from Dr. Hazel, who was at Iowa State. And I think that he really nails the challenge that we have here, right? In this red highlighted sentence, in practice, several or many traits are going to influence an animal's practical value, right? And that's what I showed on that previous slide. There are lots of different traits that we have selection tools for in the form of EPDs. So that allows us to do more accurate selection. But there's a lot of those that have an influence on the value of an animal, but they're going to do so in varying degrees. And selecting for all of those things at once can be complicated because there's going to be different values to each of those traits, depending on the production system you're in, depending on what the status of the markets are, right? So having a way to put all of these traits together and select on their aggregate economic value is really important. And so, like I said, multi-trait selection is difficult for a number of reasons. Number one, because lots of different traits matter. I showed that a couple of slides ago, but they matter in different amounts. And this is the thing to keep in mind, that docility is very important, but is it as economically important for us to focus our selection decisions on as something like weaning weight is, right? So there's going to be different values attached to each of these traits that we're using to select for. And then also keeping in mind that these traits are correlated with one another on a genetic basis. So for something like weaning weight, we might be selecting for weaning weight. And if we were doing single trait selection, so just selecting bulls on their genetic potential to wean off heavy calves, if we're keeping replacement females, what we would see over time is that our mature cow size would steadily increase, even though we were just selecting for weaning weight, right? So understanding these trait correlations is very important because we might be pulling up a trait that generates us more revenue, but at the same time, bringing up another trait that chips away at that profitability by increased resource needs for those cows and increased costs to keep them around. So understanding these traits are going to be correlated with one another is very important. And the input costs are going to change, right? Altering a trait's importance. And I think that that's as evident now as it probably ever has been, right? Our economy is really in flux right now. So understanding that the value of an extra pound of weaning weight is going to be very different now than it maybe will be in 5 years or than it was 5 years ago. So the markets fluctuate, and so too do the relevant importance of these traits. And then finally, there's going to be some variation in each operation's selection goals, right? So understanding that not every operation is selecting for wean, calf weight, and replacement female traits, right? If someone's marketing all their calves on the grid, right, they're retaining ownership, feeding calves out, selling on a carcass-based grid, the operation selection goals are going to differ. And so the relative importance of traits is also going to differ for that operation when it comes to making a sire selection decision. And so the solution for this is to use these economic selection indexes. The way I explain these is that they're EPDs per profit. So these allow us to directly compare two animals based on the profitability potential that they have in their future offspring. And so what this looks like, I skipped this slide, in practice, is that these indexes typically are reported as dollar values. And what it allows us to do is compare this gold bull to the black bull and say he has an index of $100. The gold bull has an index of $115. Just like an EPD, the index of this bull alone isn't interpretable. We have to be comparing the indexes of two animals in order to draw any sort of information out of this, right? But when we look at the difference between these, that tells us our estimated per calf difference in profitability based on a generalized production scenario across all the calves that this bull is going to have. The important thing to keep in mind, just like with EPDs, is that this is our best guess at the average of these distributions of per calf profitability. So there's going to be some calves from the black bull that are going to be more profitable than some of the calves from the gold bull, right? Not every single one of these gold bull's calves is going to be more profitable than every single one of these black bull's calves, right? This is our best guess of the average profitability and the difference that we would see if we chose to use this bull versus this bull. So again, just like interpreting an EPD, but the label on that difference that we see is a dollar value in per calf profitability. The way we construct these is actually pretty straightforward. We have all these trait predictions, something like 24 or 28 in the Angus breed. So we have predictions in the form of EPDs. What we do is we go through and put relative economic weights on these. So the dollar per unit increase in each of these EPDs, right? We weight that by the economic value. A bunch of economists at various places have helped us out in developing these values, understanding that these are going to change as the economy changes, as input costs differ. The ability to convert a pound of feed into gain is going to have a different value based on how much feed costs are, right? So these are going to change over time, but the way that we use them is once we've got our relative economic weight, we weight these EPDs by this weight, and we're able to just sum these up over all of the EPDs, understanding that depending on the index, we might have different economic weights. So for an index that's really focused on maternal traits and pre-weaning growth, our economic weight on carcass value is going to be fairly low, right? Because that doesn't directly contribute to the profitability of that index. But in general, that's how we do it. We're able to take into account the genetic correlations between traits, another very important thing that selection indexes do. But what we're left with is this one index value that's the aggregate of all of these trait predictions in their relative economic weights. A couple of things to keep in mind about indexes is that they require some assumptions, right? And they're very generalized. Okay, so we come up with this generalized production system for say a herd that sells all of its calves, sells calves at weaning and retains females, right? Or a herd that markets all of its cattle on a merit-based grid, right? So Our production system is going to come with a bunch of assumptions. And then the economic values are things that we're able to go through and determine. And typically these are on rolling averages, right? So they're not going to be on a day-to-day variable, right? Because the things in the markets can go up or down and oscillate over time. But they take sort of a snapshot over a long enough period of time that they can track long-term trends without being overly sensitive to changes in the market, right? So we use these rolling averages for costs of things, right, in making those economic weights. And keeping in mind that as inputs change, our indexes are going to reflect the impacts of those things, right? So again, this is a lot of stuff that goes under the hood from an economic perspective. But the thing to keep in mind is that regardless, these indexes have been shown to be very, very robust. So they're not super sensitive to fluctuations in prices, right? So if this little stretch of our economy's volatility, the indexes are still going to perform even though things are in flux in the economy, right? But they're generalized, right? So they're not going to be perfectly tailored to that specific day in your specific operation, but they tend to perform very well across a wide range of environments and production systems. But just keep that in mind, that there's a level of generalization that has to happen here to make these things work. One other thing that I'll mention is that our economic values often aren't linear. And what I mean by that is that we know for a lot of traits, there's this threshold where increasing the value of a trait doesn't actually contribute to additional profitability on an animal by animal basis, right? So for something like calving ease, right? Once we have an easy calving animal, adding more calving ease on top of that doesn't necessarily make you more profitable by making you any more easy calving when you're already there, right? So other things like milk, this is an example really nice from the American Angus Association, where you see this Angus milk EPD, you reach a certain point where increasing milk, right, adds to that maternal wean calf value, but it starts to plateau off here, right? There's not so much of an increase as you get into these very high milk EPDs. The reason that there's an added resource cost for that cow to make that sort of milk, and also that many cows aren't given the opportunity to express that genetic potential and produce that much more milk, right? So again, lots of these different things that we reach a sort of plateau where adding more of a trait doesn't necessarily equate to a higher profitability, and we're able to model those to better reflect our real world profitability. Three main classes of selection indexes that I'll mention here. Maternal, probably the index class that makes the most sense for Tennessee beef producers that are selling calves at weaning and retaining females in their herds, right? So this is going to focus heavily on cow traits and pre-weaning growth, as well as weight calving ease fairly heavily. No real emphasis on post-weaning growth or carcass traits. Those will show up in these terminal indexes and all-purpose indexes that sort of meld together maternal and terminal indexes for folks that are retaining females, but also retaining ownership in selling calves on a carcass-based grid. This is a not comprehensive list of selection indexes that are being reported by major breed associations. The thing I'll point out here is that for any use case, right, especially for breeds that have a place in our industry as both maternal and terminal breeds, right? You can see that there are indexes within each breed that will reflect that. Whereas for something like a Charolais that's more often than not used in a terminal context, they're just going to report terminal indexes associated with those breeds. And I'll point out some of the indexes that the Angus Association reports. The big ones being, I guess, that are relevant to us here, $M. So replacement female traits and pre-weaning gain are very heavily weighted there. Whereas $W, which was traditionally the maternal index for Angus, but it's much more heavily focused on increasing pre-weaning gain than it is on some of those other traits that are more foundational to the success of a cow herd. Those cow longevity traits, heifer pregnancy, mature weights, docility, and structural soundness EPDs. Those are going to be much more heavily weighted in this $M or dollar maternal index. Angus also reports a handful of terminal indexes. I won't dive into that because I know I'm coming up on time here in a little bit. And then one all-purpose index that takes into account almost all of the traits in the Angus evaluation. And the important thing that I'll point out here is that, and this is not specific to utilizing Angus indexes, right? But if you're going to use an index, I think it's really important for us to understand the component traits that make that index up, right? So a while back, $B or $beef was the first Angus index that was reported. And I think that the breed very quickly adopted selecting animals based on that $B value. But the issue was that in places where we're selling all of our calves at weaning and retaining females, but the bull selection on the seed stock side is happening based on this $B value, you can see pretty easily why that could create an issue when we look at the component traits that made up $B. So post-weaning gain, right? And then dry matter intake, carcass weight, ribeye area, marbling, and fat. Those were the component traits that were weighted in that $B index. Whereas the things that we know make a commercial cow-calf herd profitable, it's selling calves at weaning and retaining replacement females, things like calving ease, weaning weight, calving ease maternal, milk, mature weight, docility, heifer pregnancy, and structural soundness, none of that factored into that $B calculation. And so the issue pops up when we're trying to fit that square peg into a round hole. We need to find an index that's going to contain the component traits that make us more profitable. So I think that the $M index in Angus in particular has done a very nice job of balancing these things that more accurately reflect the sort of bull that's going to make successful daughters without sacrificing any of the performance on a weaning weight basis. And the other thing that I really like these figures from the American Red Angus Association, this is from their herd builder index, very similar to $W in the Angus breed, but these are the traits and their relative weights within that index. You'll see that the big ones, right, are heifer pregnancy, stayability. So this is a direct measure of whether or not a bull's daughters are going to stay into the herd to that profitable age of 6+ years old. Mature weight, calving ease direct, calving ease maternal, a little bit of weaning weight, and a little bit of milk weight. And so I think that this is helpful to visualize the relative importance of these things in a context where we're keeping replacement females. We've recognized that these foundational traits to the commercial cow herd are very, very important. And if we can improve on these without sacrificing weaning weight, that's going to have a more direct influence on the profitability that a bull can contribute versus just maximizing the revenue that he creates on a weaned calf weight basis. The other thing that's useful here is that even though this only includes, 7 traits, you'll see that the response to selection that we'd see if we utilize this index is going to influence a lot of traits that aren't directly in the index, right? So even though things like dry matter intake or average daily gain aren't necessarily weighted in this index, our selection for decreased mature weight, right, is going to decrease the dry matter intake that an animal, the dry matter intake EPDs of these animals as well, right? So just a good illustration, I think, of how selecting for a handful of traits when there are genetic correlations with others can reflect itself there, and why these indexes are so valuable, so that you can really balance these things. Ignore those correlations in your selection decision. Really just focus in on profitability that a bull can contribute to its offspring. And so here's another question for us. The first one is what is your number one criteria when you're out selecting a bull? Don't spill my coffee there.
All right, I got you a joke to pass some time since you requested.
All right.
Okay, so a farmer and his wife got into a huge fight, and the wife stormed off, right? She took the tractor and just needed to go cool off. So when she came back, the farmer said, well, where did you leave the tractor? And the wife said, in the mill field. And the farmer said, there's no way into the mill field. And the wife said, well, there is now. That's another thing people need to know about my jokes. They're not always the best.
No, that was good. I have made ways into middle fields before on accident, never on purpose though. So a pretty good balance of answers here. It looks like specifically the highest proportion was from was on a specific EPD, but about the same of selection indexes. So I think there's a lot of value there, right? In balancing all this, and I'll try and tie all this together at the end when it comes to making a selection decision. The components of all of these things are important, right? To making a well-informed decision. All right, and I will keep going through here, and I'm coming up on time, so I want to walk through this really quickly and then leave us with a couple thoughts before I take a couple questions. So this is a really nice little field test of the $B index. So keeping in mind, this is a terminal index, but just to demonstrate how selection indexes work when we use them to select cattle, something that Top Dollar Angus, which is an added value marketing program, did to really field test this. They created a subset of calves with low $B. So these calves averaged $47 on their $B. Another group that was high $B calves, so 141. Then what they do is they grow these calves up, they send them to a feedlot, they slaughter them, they sell these calves on a market-based, on a merit-based carcass grid, and they ask how much more profitable were these high $B calves than the low $B calves, right? Do these indexes actually translate into real-world profitability? They run a genomic test alongside this to see, okay, are these high $B calves also identified as high $B on this commercial genomic test? The answer is yes. But the real question is actual profit, right? How much more profitable is this group of high $B animals compared to the low $B animals? Our guess based on the selection indexes of these two groups of calves is that there'd be about $187 per calf difference in profitability between this high group and the low group. In reality, what we see is that this was over $200 difference in these calves from the high $B being more profitable than calves from the low $B group. In the thing that we see when we break out on all of these individual traits that contribute to the profitability of animals, we see really across the board, these high $B calves were excelling compared to their low $B contemporaries. And that's ultimately what directly translates into profit, right? These calves they had a greater weight per day of age, spent less time on feed, they had heavier carcass weights, they were more heavily marbled, bigger ribeyes, lower yield grades, and ultimately had higher carcass values. They saved money on the feed yard, and that translated directly, like I said, into this $215 difference in the profit between these two groups, right? So this example, not necessarily in particular relevant to a lot of us, unless we're retaining ownership in selling calves on a grid, but just to demonstrate the power of a selection index to identify animals that are going to have calves that excel across a number of traits that relate directly to the profitability of our particular scenario. You'd see something similar if you ran an experiment where you made high $M calves and low $M calves. If you were keeping replacement females over time, you'd expect to see that large profitability difference between the high and low groups, but just in a different production scenario. I'm going to skip through this example and just point a couple of things out. So something that I've had folks say is that you can be a high indexing animal in a lot of different ways. And this really factors into how I help producers out when we're talking about identifying selection candidates, using indexes, using EPDs alongside each other. And this is why I think having a breeding goal and understanding your own herd is very important, right? So bull 1 and bull 2, these are both very, very high $M indexing bulls, right? Bull 1 is in the second percentile with a plus 90. Bull 2 is in the third percentile with a plus $88 both excellent bulls. The thing that I'll say is that depending on your needs from a sire selection standpoint, there might be a very clear bull that you'd choose here versus just choosing based on this $M overall profitability metric, right? So in particular, if you're looking for a bull to put on heifers, it's very clear that we would want to focus on bull number 2 down here because he's in the top 1% for calving ease, whereas bull number 1 is in the top, he's only in the top 80% for calving ease, right? So a very clear calving ease candidate here. And calving ease, not something that even though it's weighted in this index, isn't core to the importance, right? Because this index is going to assume that you're breeding the majority of these bulls, or the majority of animals that get bred by these bulls are mature cows. So something to keep in mind when you're using an index. You've got to focus still on calving ease if you're going to put these bulls on heifers. And then the other thing that just comes out when I'm comparing these two example bulls, right, are these claw and foot angle EPDs. So measures of structural soundness predictions that we have. If you're having some feet and leg issues, right, using bull A might be better than using bull B here, because this bull's in the top 20 and 10% versus being in the top 45% of the breed, would allow you to make a little bit more genetic progress on these feet and leg traits. So again, I think that there's this mix of using indexes to identify the top tier bulls for your production scenario, but then still utilizing these individual EPDs to make quicker genetic progress on the traits that you might be focused on in your herd, right? The more urgent needs you can address using individual EPDs, but using these indexes to sort out a top tier of animals to select from, I think is very helpful. And then the last thoughts that I'll leave us with are seed stock considerations. And if there are any seed stock folks on here, these are just kind of my 2 cents worth. And that's that I think that sometimes we're pointing our customers to the wrong tools, right? Or we're not pointing them to the right ones is maybe the better way to say that. This is directly from a UT bull catalog, where our index values that we've said are very, very important are buried in the second row on the far right. They're certainly not the first place that your eyes go to. Another one from the UT bull test, right? And we don't even have maybe the most relevant maternal index in this little sire summary, right? So again, we're giving lots of data to our producers, right? As seed stock producers, how do we help focus in on these indexes, right? Really put them front and center. And I think that it can be as simple as catalog layout sometimes, right? Focusing in on these things that help producers identify those top tier bulls without taking any information out. I think that the Leachman group does a really nice job. They've got their own set of indexes that they market, right? But it is front and center there, right? This bull's dollar profit index is the first thing that you see. And again, without sacrificing any amount of information that we're providing. So just some considerations to keep in mind on that front. I'll skip that question and go to my takeaways here. Maybe first, tying everything together here in the sire selection made easy slide. I don't mean that I don't ever have any silver bullets, but this is about as close to concrete recommendations you'll get from me without me saying it depends, right? But when it comes to selecting a sire in a commercial herd, I think that the first thing we need to do is identify a crossbreeding plan that works and understand the bull and the breed that makes the most sense at that time point. Then use that to restrict the number of places that we're going to look for bulls. Then identify an index that's going to be the most useful for our production situation. For most of us, that's going to be a maternal index of some sort. Sort out that top tier of bulls, right? Don't use that index to directly, rank your bulls and say, this is for sure the first bull I want, then this bull, right? Identify that top tier of animals. Then we can start to utilize those individual EPDs to find complements to our herd's needs, right? If we need to drag one trait up, can we find animals within this top tier of indexing bulls that have favorable EPDs for that? Being mindful of accuracy. So I didn't talk about genomics today, right? But understanding that's going to increase the accuracy, help us make more effective selection decisions. Then also keeping in mind that these are all tools, right? But we still need to do a sound phenotypic evaluation of a bull, right? That some things we aren't able to directly measure in an EPD, including a bull's structural soundness himself, right? Not only because that's heritable in his offspring, but an unsound bull is not going to be able to breed cows, right? So making sure that we don't skimp out, even when we have all these selection tools, on a sound phenotypic evaluation. And then we can take into account price considerations, right? Understanding that a $10,000 bull might be really, really good, right? He might check all these boxes for us, but if we're not able to make that bull profitable over the long term, right, we need to take into account price in our buying decisions. Can we buy a marginally lower EPD or lower indexing bull, but make up for some of that on a price front, right? But all things to keep in mind. I'll throw up my takeaways here and a bunch of really great resources if you're looking for them on the beef cattle genetics side. that a group of extension specialists have put together here at eBeef. And I'll take any questions if we've got a little bit of time left.
Yeah, we got a couple minutes, and we had a really good question come in when you were talking about crossbreeding. And I understand that this question could be an entire presentation in and of itself, but if you just want some real quick little synopsis of it. So you talked about the benefits of using crossbreeding with those pounds weaned, specifically in your steer calves if you're going to be selling per pound. But what kind of benefits are we going to see with retained females?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question, and usually something that I spend 4 or 5 slides talking about. But I think that crossbreeding in particular is the most important when we're keeping replacement females. And the reason that I say that is that the heterosis, so that overperformance of that crossbred offspring compared to its parents, the overperformance that we see in that crossbred offspring is maximized in traits that are lower heritability. And the traits that tend to be the most lowly heritable are things like fertility, cow longevity, health, immune function, and all of those more maternal traits tend to have lower heritability. So a lower proportion of that phenotypic variance that's controlled by genetics. And so what that means is that because heterosis and heritability are inversely related, we're going to see a greater amount of heterosis in traits that in those lowly heritable traits that are more focused on the female traits that I talked about. We call them, foundational traits. We're gonna see a bigger proportion of advantage from heterosis in those female-based traits, right? So that's why the crossbred baldy female has sort of become this standard for maternal productivity, right? Cow longevity, all those things, because we're seeing way more heterosis in those female-based traits, and a big reason why having crossbred females in your commercial herd helps out, in the short term, but also in successive generations, because they're retaining that heterosis from generation to generation.
Awesome. And we just had another very interesting and really good question come in. So do you ever recommend bringing in heifers to take advantage of crossbreeding instead of just utilizing a bull?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. I think that there's a lot of value in if you can purchase a good set of commercial, that first generation F1 cross heifers, right? I think that purchasing heifers and taking advantage of heterosis that way is a great option, especially if you're coming in with a third breed. So you've got F1 baldy females that you purchased, right? Coming in with a more terminal cross, right? A Charolais, a Limousine, something to add some red meat there. There's a lot of value in doing that, because you've got 3 generations or 3 breeds that you've introduced there. You're maximizing heterosis both on the female side and on that direct heterosis that you get from the sire that you bring in. So lots of opportunities, especially when you're purchasing females, to maximize heterosis in that way.
Yeah, awesome. Well, with that, I don't see any more pressing questions, and just for the sake of time and appreciating the use of people's days coming in here in the middle of your work day or whatever you have going on today. So thank you everyone for joining in for this series. Thank you, Troy, for speaking and being our finale speaker. We hope everyone has enjoyed the series. And that is going to be it for today. If you need access to the recordings or anything, you can just contact your county agent as always. And you should see the survey as soon as I end this. So thank you. Bye, Troy.
All right. Thanks, y'all.